All right, are we ready to go? We good to go? Give me a thumbs up. Let me know you guys are with me. Let me know you guys are with me. All right. My apologies. I was not feeling well. And so had to go to the doctor and whatnot, but I'm back. You guys have no idea who I am, but my name is Lawrence Ware. I'm from Oklahoma State University. I'm a professor of philosophy there, also the associate director of the Center for Africana Studies. Okay, so welcome back to the social media race and community knowledge practices conferences. We're so glad you've had a wonderful lunch and you've joined us. Hopefully you had a salad or some Chick-fil-A, something good to eat. We have three presentations left this afternoon, and we'll be back tomorrow with several more thought-provoking presentations. My name is Lawrence Ware, as I've just said. I'm going to let my other moderator go ahead and introduce himself.
Hi, and nice to meet you, Lawrence. I am Dr. Carlos Hill. I'm a professor at the University of Oklahoma in the Claire Looper Department of African American Studies, and I will be co-moderating this conversation as well.
I may be sniffling and coughing from time to time, but I promise you, whatever I have, you cannot get it because we are in a digital space so you can feel comfortable to be yourself. If you're just joining us, you can find more information in the chat. Our next presenter is Dr. Karen Frost-Arnold. Dr. Frost-Arnold is a professor of philosophy at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. Her book, Who Should We Be Online? A Social Epistemology for the Internet was published this year by Oxford University Press. Congratulations to her on that. She will speak to us today about platform problems, how social media companies obstruct and exploit movements for racial justice.
And comments will be offered by Professor Joseph Tye, the Watson Centennial Chair and Associate Dean for Research at the University of Oklahoma College of Law. Professor Tye served on the legal team that successfully challenged Oklahoma's same-sex marriage ban a year before the Supreme Court upheld marriage equality nationwide. And so we will hear from him after Dr. Frost-Arnold's presentation.
Okay, thank you all so much for that introduction. And I hope you're feeling okay, Dr. Ware. Thanks for joining us this afternoon or for doing this work. And I'm really excited to hear Professor Tye's comments. So thank you all so much for inviting me to this amazing conference. I've really had just a really engaging time so far today. Let me see if I can do that thing, you got to do, share your PowerPoint, see if it works. This is the scary part. Go. Okay. Can folks see that okay? You can hear me? Okay. Yes, success. Okay. So I want to start by talking about how social media companies have profited from their image as vital media for social movements. From Facebook and Twitter's much hyped and perhaps overhyped role in the 2011 Arab Spring to hashtag Black Lives Matter and TikTok teens activism, social media platforms have cultivated brands based on the virality of social movement work. I'm going to draw on a really wonderful paper titled When Twitter Got #Woke, Black Lives Matter, DeRay McKesson, Twitter and the Appropriation of the Aesthetics of Protest by Farida Viss, Simon Faulkner, Sophia Mojan Noble, and Hannah Guy in 2020. And they use this photo as what they call a door into analyzing the role of social media platforms in movements for racial justice. So I'll just do an audio description of this image. So the caption says that the main person here in the photo who is being arrested is DeRay McKesson. This is a photo of, we're at the side of a highway. There's a Black man who is kneeling. He is being arrested. He has his arms behind his back. And he has a t-shirt that says #StayWoke on it with the Twitter logo right underneath. So this excellent paper analyzed this photo, and they use it to uncover, quote, the complex relations that exist between contemporary Black protest in the United States and technology companies like Twitter that play an increasingly significant role in the information and news ecosystem. On the one hand, Black Lives Matter activists have effectively used Twitter and other social media platforms for their work. Twitter has been particularly useful platform for activists, and we'll talk about how things have changed recently since Elon Musk purchased the platform. But on the other hand, Viss et al. Point out that Twitter also courted celebrity activists such as DeRay McKesson and used the language of being, quote, woke and the Black Lives Matter hashtag to promote a progressive brand while simultaneously working to depoliticize the language of wokeness and failing to make real commitments to racial justice in their own tech sector. So they write, for many people, being or becoming politically aware or woke, to use the parlance relevant to Black Lives Matter, is now significantly dependent on social media communications. Yet at the same time, this relationship between political awareness and social media also allows social media companies to link themselves to political dissent, enabling them to develop and benefit from an appearance of corporate progressiveness. So in this talk today, I want to analyze social media companies' exploitation of movements for racial justice as a type of epistemic injustice. I'm going to argue that social media companies engage in epistemic injustice by exploiting and obstructing movements for racial justice. So since this is an interdisciplinary conference, I'll begin by giving just a very brief introduction to the philosophical work on epistemic injustice. Then I'll draw on two types of epistemic injustice, epistemic appropriation and epistemic dumping, and I'll apply that to social media. So I'm going to just begin with that brief introduction to the field. So the study of epistemic injustice is a field at the intersection of epistemology, ethics, and political philosophy. Scholars in this field take into account the fact that historical context, power relations, prejudices, and social structures shape what we know, what knowledge circulates in a community, who is taken as an authoritative knower, and other important aspects of our knowledge-producing communities and lives. Because we live in unjust societies, that injustice shapes our epistemic interactions. Although there's some debate about how broadly or narrowly to use this term, I find the following definition of epistemic injustice useful. So, quote, those forms of unfair treatment that relate to issues of knowledge, understanding, and participation in communicative practices. So much work in epistemic injustice focuses on identifying types of unjust treatment in the production of knowledge. So the field has generated a plethora, some people think maybe too many types of terms for epistemic injustice, including testimonial injustice, hermeneutical injustice, testimonial smothering, and others. While the drive to create more and more labels for types of injustice can make the field somewhat jargon heavy, I think there is value in producing a taxonomy for types of epistemic dysfunction and unfairness. When philosophers listen to the experiences of marginalized people and help develop with them a language to express the oppression they face, we gain tools to identify and also organize against pervasive injustices. So in this section, I'm going to talk about a term, epistemic appropriation, which was introduced by Emmeline Davis. So this is a term for sort of a theft of intellectual labor. So Davis identifies two harms of epistemic appropriation, which she calls epistemic detachment and epistemic misdirection. So in epistemic detachment, the participatory role of marginalized contributors in the process of knowledge production is obscured. It's hidden. So marginalized people are producing knowledge, they're participating in the production of knowledge, but their work is being obscured. In epistemic misdirection, that occurs when epistemic resources developed within but detached from the margins are utilized in dominant discourses in ways that disproportionately benefit the powerful. So if you put these two together, in epistemic appropriation, the epistemic work of marginalized people, the work that they perform in creating concepts, language, and other epistemic resources is erased, and their epistemic products, their concepts, their work, their theories, are used in mainstream context to the benefit of the powerful. Essentially, the powerful exploit the epistemic labor of the marginalized. So let's return to Viss et al.'s analysis of the photograph of the DeRay McKesson arrest. So they draw our attention to the use of the Stay Woke hashtag on the t-shirt that McKesson is wearing. So McKesson had at least a 2-year relationship with Twitter prior to the 2016 arrest that's captured in the photo in Baton Rouge. Part of his origin as a celebrity activist came from his tweets from Black Lives Matter protests starting in Ferguson in 2014. And that was the point at which he made contact with Jack Dorsey, who at the time was Twitter's CEO. McKesson's ongoing relationship with Twitter included an onstage event at Twitter headquarters. He played some role in the testing and the development of the live streaming Twitter app Periscope. And he also appeared alongside Dorsey at a tech conference in 2016. It was at this conference that all of the attendees were given the hashtag Stay Woke t-shirts, which the Viss et al. Hypothesized that maybe this is likely where McKesson's t-shirt came from. So they analyzed the history of the term wokeness and noticed that it has a history stretching back to the 60s and 70s, and that it had come into more prominence recently in connection with Black Lives Matter use of the term, which they argued that Black Lives Matter at the time was using it to refer to, quote, a state of awareness of structural racism within the United States. So a particular focus on racism. But they argue that this is not the notion of wokeness that Twitter's CEO put forward when he was asked about the meaning of wokeness at that very conference when Twitter was handing out these hashtag Stay Woke with the Twitter logo t-shirts. So when asked about it, Dorsey responded that being woke is about, quote, really being aware and staying aware and keeping questioning. So Viss et al. Argue that the empty vagueness of this response reflects, quote, a disinclination to define wokeness as such, indicating that Twitter wanted to gain an association with the general idea of being politically aware and with the general idea of justice without connecting themselves explicitly and fully with the politics of Black Lives Matter, right? Dorsey does not mention structural racism, does not engage in that, even though that's how the term is being currently used by activists. They also draw on Gia Tolentino's critique of Dorsey, where she says, you can't further degrade an already degraded social justice slogan for your corporation's t-shirt and also enjoy the kind of high-minded profiteering blandness that requires you to never call racism by its name. So this, I argue, is just one example of the epistemic appropriation of the labor of Black Lives Matter activists by Twitter and other social media platforms, right? As Viss et al. Argue, it's sort of a door, a window into this persistent practice of appropriating that labor and those concepts. The labor of activists who created renewed meanings for being woke in the context of uprising against the unjust killings of Black people is obscured by the decontextualized Stay Woke hashtag. And the appropriation of this slogan by corporations, known for their lack of diversity in their own workforce, detaches the language from its context in the margins and puts it to work for the powerful. So this is where we are. I'm going to switch now to a second type of epistemic injustice that I've written more about. So in this section, I'm going to discuss an injustice in the distribution of epistemic labor. So we might ask two questions. So I'm going to introduce this term epistemic trash. And so I'll define that in a minute, but just to ask these questions, we might think about who's tasked with identifying and cleaning up the epistemic trash produced by a community, and how are they treated in doing this work? So what do I mean by epistemic trash, right? So consider the fact that all knowledge production involves missteps, mistakes, and bias, and all kinds of problems. It's a messy process, right, producing knowledge, which means that epistemic communities, knowledge-producing communities, are constantly producing what I call epistemic trash. So epistemic trash is the unwanted byproducts of knowledge production. So it includes, among many other types of things we might call trash, mistaken theories, poorly constructed data sets, unjustified claims, false beliefs, miscommunications. These are all things that routinely occur as we attempt to produce knowledge together. Well-functioning epistemic communities have what we might metaphorically call trash removal mechanisms, right? Means of discarding the byproducts, the things we don't want, right? But in poorly organized epistemic community, the trash accumulates. These false beliefs, these miscommunications start piling up around us and prevent our ability to really produce knowledge together. This is particularly problematic when the trash is toxic. In other words, when the mistaken theories, beliefs, data sets, etc., do practical harm. The accumulation of toxic epistemic trash not only impedes the knowledge production process, but it also harms both the epistemic community and the public as a whole. So as an example of toxic epistemic trash, I would consider the damage done to discussions of police brutality by the misunderstanding of the phrase Black Lives Matter as intended to mean only Black Lives Matter. And I would argue a lot of those misinterpretations are willful ignorance. This misinterpretation lurks around in discussions of the issues, and conversations of police brutality are frequently derailed by often white people in the grips of this misinterpretation, who insist on all lives matter as an alternative. What epistemic communities discussing police brutality need is for this misinterpretation to be discarded as the toxic trash that it is. So that's just one example of how I'm using this phrase. So I think this term, and thinking about trash removal mechanisms and how we deal with it, helps us pose some really fruitful questions. Who sorts and removes epistemic trash? What kinds of harms does one incur from handling toxic epistemic trash? Who does the labor of removing epistemic trash? Who's aware of the existence of epistemic trash? And who willfully ignores the epistemic trash just building up around us? So to identify some of these problems, in my book, I introduce this term epistemic dumping as a type of epistemic injustice that addresses what I see in many knowledge-producing communities as an injustice. So I define this as a form of epistemic injustice in which the labor of sorting, handling, and disposing of the toxic epistemic trash of epistemic communities is disproportionately performed by some groups. Those are traditionally oppressed groups, while other, typically traditionally dominant groups, benefit from this labor, though usually being oblivious to its performance and dismissive of the epistemic labor involved in handling the trash. So this is a form of injustice in epistemic communities in two ways. First, epistemic dumping constitutes a kind of distributive justice because the burdens of tidying up an epistemic community are not fairly distributed. Some groups end up performing more of the sorting and handling of epistemic trash, while other groups avoid this difficult, often taxing, and quite skilled labor. Second, epistemic dumping typically involves a lack of respect for the skills and labor of those who handle epistemic trash. It's often not valued, not rewarded, and not well compensated. So the first two examples are ones that I talk about in the book. I'm just going to briefly mention them and focus on the last one in this talk. So in my book, I talk about how a lot of the labor that commercial content moderators perform illustrates epistemic dumping. So these are the folks who are often sitting in office parks around the world who are being fed the worst of the internet, the things that have been reported as violent hate speech, disturbing videos. And they sit there often having to go through a stream of this content and deciding whether the content should be removed from the platform or whether it should stay up. These are folks who are literally doing the taking out the trash of the worst of the internet. These folks are often very poorly compensated. It's often subcontracted work that social media companies outsource to often workers in the global South. It's highly traumatizing work. It's not well compensated, not well valued, and they often experience a lot of trauma from doing that work. So that's one example. In the book, I also, an example that might be more familiar to many of us in academics is if we consider the invisible labor that often marginalized faculty perform, right? Just as the task of tidying up the hate speech of online platforms falls to commercial content moderation workers, the task of handling the aftermath of an act of hate speech on campus often falls to marginalized faculty. It's often faculty of color who are called upon to deal with the fallout when their white colleagues teach racist material. Homophobic or transphobic speech acts in classroom are often brought to the attention of queer and trans faculty. In all these examples, toxic epistemic trash is disproportionately brought to the doors of marginalized faculty who are asked to perform various kinds of diversity work, often uncompensated, not really valued in the tenure and promotion process. So that's another example to just kind of give you a sense of how I'm using this term. So today, I want to argue that epistemic dumping is a useful concept to understand the labor that's often dumped on people of color who are involved in movements for racial justice. So here we want to think about how online harassment is disproportionately targeted against marginalized people. For example, women, people of color, and queer folks. The amount of hate speech and harassment that people of color doing racial justice work have to deal with can be staggering. As social media companies have both adopted flawed conceptions of free speech and also tried to perform commercial content moderation on the cheap, they've often failed to provide adequate protections from online harassment. And when they do, in fact, put moderation policies in place, they often disproportionately censor marginalized people who try to push back against harassment or advocate for social justice. So for example, Hameson et al., their study of users who had content removed from social media platforms found that, quote, Black participants were more likely to have content removed if it related to racial justice or described racism, or content removed describing feminist viewpoints. So often what we see, right, it's actually, you know, there's racist speech online, and when people of color push back or challenge the racist speech, they themselves are censored. They are often accused of being anti-white racists or something like that. So these are failures of moderation. These failures of moderation create additional labor for people of color who post about their lives and do work for racial justice. By failing to adequately deal with the problem of online harassment by creating functional moderation systems, social media companies dump epistemic labor on marginalized people. This labor takes several forms. So first form of a kind of work that people are often performing that I want to think of as sort of like taking out the trash or handling the trash is that users have to create, curate, and apply block lists or other mechanisms to reduce their exposure to harassment. Block lists can be useful third-party tools. However, the fact that users have to spend time and effort maintaining a system of block lists is a result of the labor dumped on them by the platforms. Javert and et al. Study of people who use block lists found that, quote, many participants who found block lists useful still pointed out that they would much rather have Twitter address the problem of harassment effectively, so they didn't have to use third-party tools like block lists, unquote. So when social media companies failed to tackle harassment effectively, they dumped the labor of dealing with the trash of harassment on potential victims. Second, communities of color online have had to develop skills and techniques of identifying imposters who pretend to be people of color online to sow discord and spread disinformation. The creation of sock puppet accounts that fake the identity of marginalized people has been a pervasive and damaging practice. So I'll just give you one example where I think if folks had listened to Black women a long time ago, many problems could have been avoided. So for example, in 2014, anti-feminist 4chan users conducted a coordinated campaign to spread the fake hashtag End Father's Day. So the idea is they wanted to make it look like feminists were really silly because feminists wanted to get rid of Father's Day. Okay. So fake feminist Twitter accounts, particularly fake accounts of Black women, were used to post messages arguing that Father's Day should be abolished. Black women on Twitter fought back by self-organizing to expose the imposters using the hashtag Your Slip is Showing. So the failure of online platforms to deal with this coordinated imposter campaign targeted against Black women foreshadowed future harassment, including the Gamergate attacks on women in the video game industry. Taking out the trash of these imposters is labor disproportionately handled by people of color working for social justice online. It's another example of epistemic dumping. Finally, when people of color have to deal with the biased misfires of moderation systems, they end up performing labor that is not as dumped as often on white users. Contacting platforms to appeal sanctions for posting content that challenges white supremacy and has been censored takes work. Black TikTok creators who suspect their Black Lives Matter content has been shadow banned have to perform additional labor inquiring why their videos are not being shown to users, and they often have to re-record or find new avenues to share their voices. In some, when social media companies fail to handle harassment, hate speech, and online imposters targeted against people of color working for racial justice, they dump the labor of handling those problems onto those who are already performing essential labor. And so when social media companies censor the speech of activists for racial justice, they create additional work for those activists who have to fight for their space, fight to secure their space in the epistemic community. And this is an epistemic injustice. So just to conclude, I want to pull together the two threads of this talk by looking back and also looking forward, because a lot of my examples have been about Twitter pre-Elon Musk, and we have to recognize that and talk about some of the current challenges we're facing. So if we focus on Twitter prior to Elon Musk's 2022 takeover, we see an interesting and hypocritical combination of epistemic appropriation and epistemic dumping by the platform. Twitter appropriated the language and cultural cachet of activists for racial justice, while also dumping the labor of handling the harassment that these activists suffered onto them. But if we look at the present and the possible future, we have to notice that Musk has dropped the facade of progressivism that generated much of the brand value and public value that Twitter had as a public space. His right-wing agenda for the platform is clear. Musk has taken many steps to slash the slim protections that Twitter did have. He laid off thousands of moderators. He fired the machine learning ethics team and the human rights team, among many other sort of firings and decimations of the slim protections. And when he was interviewed by Tucker Carlson about the layoffs of 80% of Twitter's employees, Musk responded, quote, "It turns out you don't need all that many people to run Twitter. If you're not trying to run some kind of glorified activist organization and you're not caring that much about censorship, you can really let go of a lot of people, it turns out." The irony that he thinks he's not engaging in an activist organization should not be lost on us. So Musk's moves raise pressing questions about the future problems that movements for racial justice face on platforms such as what he's now calling X. What additional labor will be dumped on them after the destruction of the meager protections Twitter provided? And if Musk follows through on his repeated threats to remove the block feature, how will activists have to organize themselves in new ways to protect their access to that public space if they even want to stay on Twitter? So it's my hope that this talk has provided some useful tools from the epistemic injustice literature that we can collectively use to understand our predicament and collectively organize to deal with these current and future platform problems and to continue the work for racial justice online. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frost-Arnold, for that amazing paper, and I will be using epistemic appropriation. Thank you. And I just want to invite Professor Joseph Tai to provide a comment to your paper.
Yes, well, thank you as well, Dr. Frost-Arnold. That was just a terrific presentation, and like your paper, it was insightful and compelling. Like Dr. Hill, I learned a lot from your work, and I've gained vocabulary to talk about racial and social injustice, so I very much appreciate that. I don't have any direct comments or critical questions about the substance of your argument. Instead, I'd like to kick off the discussion by inviting your thoughts on the first question that came to mind when I finished reading your paper, and partly inspired by the questions that you posed for the future, which is this: given the dismantling of the already meager content moderation infrastructure of X by Elon Musk and the systemic epistemic appropriation and dumping that other major social media platforms also engage in for corporate image and corporate profit, how can racial and social justice advocates organize and protect themselves and really break out of this cycle of epistemic appropriation, dumping, and injustice?
Would you like me to answer that now? Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you so
have any
much.
thoughts on that, because
Yeah.
it is a serious problem that you identified, and you gave us the terminology to think about this very clearly. Yeah. And so I'm just wondering if there are solutions that you would suggest or lines of thinking to pursue.
So I have sort of a depressing answer. For a while, I was really excited about the opportunities that alternative social media provides, like Mastodon and other non-corporate social media platforms, because it seems like one strategy folks might use is creating their own spaces where they can create their own systems of moderation. They can use their own strategies to protect themselves and to amplify their message and to organize. The reason why this is a bit of a depressing answer is that white supremacy is alive and well in some of these alternative social media spaces. So I will put in the chat, but Jonathan Flowers has been doing some really excellent public philosophy on what he calls the whiteness of Mastodon. So we see some of these social media spaces that people of color have been creating for themselves have been attacked by white folks, have online harassment against people of color has been really a problem in Mastodon after Musk took over Twitter. A lot of people created accounts on Mastodon, and then people of color often found it to be a hostile space. So sort of one of, I think, so the solution of this, and this is something that I talk about in my book, is that, you know, white folks also need to get their act together, right? So even if folks can create their own spaces, right, if white people are going to continue to insert themselves in conversations that were to talk about some of the issues that Professor Steele was talking about, insert themselves in conversations that were not necessarily meant for them, and to derail conversations or to harass people, one of those opportunities, which I was excited about, is going to be not quite so functional as one might hope. So that's the first thing that came to mind thinking about your question. And I'll put that reference in the chat for folks.
So I have another question. When I was reading your paper, I was thinking about the extent to which AI will affect, for better or for worse, the epistemic injustices that are committed by social media platforms. AI can be leveraged at inhuman speed and scale for content creation, dissemination, and perhaps moderation. Do you have a sense, pessimistic or optimistic, about whether AI will make things better or worse for social and racial justice advocates, and how they can leverage AI as a tool?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it depends on who's creating the AI and to what extent they are incorporating social justice concerns as they are generating the AI. Unfortunately, right, there is so much evidence that large language models encode various kinds of biases, including racial biases. There's a good reference that I'll also put in the chat, right? So that, for example, in hate speech detection, some of the tools that have been used have been biased against African-American vernacular English, so that folks who use that kind of speech actually end up having their speech censored and monitored as hate speech disproportionately. So I don't think there's a reason to think that just AI by itself can be a solution if we don't also deal with the biases that are so prevalent in that. But that's not to say that, right, there aren't tons of people who are working on AI who are completely aware of these issues and maybe could develop tools which are less racist in those ways. So I just don't think that's what we see from the industry right now. So I'm kind of pessimistic about that being used by the platforms.
I have a comment and more questions, but I want to yield to the audience. I see that there's a question in the chat, and also Dr. Blevins has his hand up.
Yes. So first, before we begin, first of all, I want to apologize for having the hat on. I'm kind of vague, and I have not vague, I have vein. I have like shiny head thing because I have a bald head, so my apologies. Anyway, so please add your questions to the Q&A. Also, panelists from other sessions are welcome to unmute and ask questions as well. But we do already have a question in the chat, so I'll just go ahead and give that to you now. And you can answer it now if you like. It says, great presentation. Given the concentrated ownership and control structures of social media, to what extent should we entrust waste management to these for-profit corporations? It goes on to say, as someone who has done excellent research on epistemology of prejudice that has called for a kind of hopeful trust, how might such a proactive approach on part of Twitter be used de facto or explicitly as a way for ignorant folks to perpetuate their epistemic echo chambers? Wonderful question. Interesting. It's a complicated question, but it's a good question. What do you think?
That is a really lovely question. So I think there's a couple of parts to this. One, and maybe I've sort of already tackled this with my sort of first comments about Mastodon. I don't have a lot of trust in corporate media to be doing this, right? So, I mean, we can engage in consumer activism. We can vote with, I was going to say vote with our feet, but we don't have feet on social media. I don't know. We can vote with which platforms we use and which ones we leave to try and push social media companies to develop better systems. But on the whole, any kind of, public space which is organized around profit rather than epistemic goals or goals for social justice, I think is gonna have problems. So I don't have a lot of trust in them. I really appreciate this commenter's use of some of my other work on this idea of hopeful trust. So there, the idea is that sometimes you can encourage people to be more trustworthy by extending trust to them, right? So if I trust you and I make myself vulnerable to you, sometimes people will respond because they have a desire not to betray my trust. And so the question here suggests maybe might social media platforms extend that kind of trust? I think it's a really interesting idea. I just am not sure that I have a relationship with Twitter as a platform where if Twitter trusts me, then I'm going to respond to them, because part of what's going on here is we have a platform, but we also have the interactions between the users and the ones that I'm particularly concerned with today, the activists for racial justice. I'm not sure that I want to, and this wouldn't be how I would position myself anyway, ask them to extend trust to folks who have often betrayed their trust and have not shown themselves to be trustworthy. So maybe I would connect this to some of my work, that it's incumbent upon people who have privilege to demonstrate that they are trustworthy, that they can be participants in a conversation that one might want to have, rather than people who are going to attack them or infiltrate movements for racial justice in really harmful ways. So I hope that sort of gets to that really complicated question. Thanks.
I believe Dr. Ty said that someone had their hand up. I don't see the hand being up, but if you do have a question, please unmute yourself and ask that question. Feel free to, or drop it in the chat.
Sure, that was me. Professor Frost-Arnold, I loved your presentation. I'm going to take epistemic trash and run with that. And I also like the idea of epistemic echo chambers. So my question is this, and then I'll kind of support it with a comment, is whose responsibility ultimately is it to deal with epistemic trash? I would think of another form of it would be fake news or propaganda or disinformation campaigns that we see. Oftentimes they might originate on social media. So whether it was about COVID and being a hoax and hydroxychloroquine as being a treatment, or election, denialism, it's not just happening on, on social media. It may come from, a QAnon or a politician, but then it gets repeated on Fox News, OAN, and then, people are talking about it, interpersonally. And it's like, oh, it seems like it's coming from all these different sources. Well, I've followed this politician. My friend says it. It looks like it's coming from several different sources online. And I thought it was interesting you addressed the AI part, where we do seem to always kind of be looking for technological solutions to problems that are started by technology. But what really leads to my question, there was a poll, I want to say it was a Pew poll in 2018, where they asked people, like, what's the biggest problem today? And it was fake news. And that topped like all these other hot button issues like healthcare, taxes, this, that, and the other. They blame politicians for the problem, but expected journalists to fix it. And I'm like, well, we could have all the, valid reporting out there, but I really think we're at this moment of crisis, because there is so much epistemic trash. Whose job is it to sort through it all? But thank you. That's my question.
It's a lovely question. And I don't think there's one party who has some responsibility, right? So each of us has our own epistemic responsibility not to share stuff without, doing some due diligence. But I'm very hesitant with some of the approaches to dealing with, say, fake news, for example, that put all of the responsibility on the individual and argue that, say, media literacy is the response, because there are quite sophisticated disinformation campaigns, either organized by sort of folks on, these social media places like 4chan, but also state actors, right? We also, one of the things that social media does is it exposes us to a wide variety of issues that it's very hard for each of us as individuals to keep up on, to be appropriate detectors of whether or not something is false in all of the evidence. So yes, we each have to do our own due diligence, but platforms also clearly bear some responsibility if they're going to present themselves to be sort of like this public sphere, right? But part of the problem here is that they're primarily there for profit, right? And I know this is something that Professor Tai is interested in and maybe more qualified to talk about when it comes to the law governing free speech. But I think it's really interesting to think about the different ways that different countries and different places around the world deal with issues of free speech, right? So in the US, we have First Amendment issues, but Europe has been really active in really holding social media companies accountable for dealing with some of these issues. And I think it'll be interesting to see how those go ahead, because social media is a global enterprise. And although the companies are hosted here in the US and are susceptible and have to follow US First Amendment law, there are also people around the world who don't necessarily agree with that kind of approach to free speech and are being sort of led around by the US corporations who are making their own decisions. So I would say they do have some responsibility, but the nature of that responsibility is really complicated when we are dealing with a global platform where there are all different kinds of expectations from places all around the world.
With that, if I can just hop in with a comment and an invitation for reflection on what I think is epistemic appropriation by these social media platforms about free speech. And so, time and again, we've seen Musk and Zuckerberg justify all the vitriol, the hate, the violence, the racism on their platforms by taking the high ground of free speech, saying that's what they're defending. And of course, if you look back over the course of the development of First Amendment protections in the 20th century, a lot of that was in cases involving social and religious minorities, the protection against fighting words or fighting words and incitement. They were by cases involving anarchists, involving religious minorities, involving socialists. The protections for defamation, of course, arose in the South, New York Times v. Sullivan, in cases against civil rights activists. But yet we see these corporations claim that they are defending free speech when in actuality they're doing the opposite, right? They're undermining core free speech principles, the protection of marginal voices, and the promotion of democratic self-governance when they're allowing speech that does the opposite to propagate in their platforms. And so, when they say that they're merely defending the First Amendment or being bound by the First Amendment, I think it's a bit of gaslighting. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too, because in fact, as private corporations, they're not bound by the First Amendment at all. And so they can't claim to be the public square without actually adhering to First Amendment principles rather than the whims of billionaires. So in my view, they should be one or the other. They should either commit themselves to First Amendment law, or they should just honestly admit that they are in fact corporate censorship machines that propagate speech for their own profit, often at the cost of marginalized communities. So that's my comment. I'm wondering if you have reflections on what I see as epistemic appropriation and injustice by corporations seizing the free speech mantle.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with your points about free speech. I mean, I think the gaslighting is intentional, right? The tech companies have wanted to have it both ways. And I think you're completely right to call them out on that. I'm not sure Emmeline Davis would necessarily call that epistemic appropriation, just because for her, she's particularly interested in how the epistemic tools of marginalized people are detached from their work and taken to be used in ways that benefit the powerful. And the language of free speech doesn't necessarily fall into that as like a concept that was necessarily developed by marginalized people. But it's certainly a use and exploitation of the language, or a disingenuous use of the language of free speech in ways that are meant to sort of spur their corporate profit. And I think I think part of what's fascinating about Elon Musk is the complete transparency of it, right? That he can claim to have bought this platform because he wanted free speech, and then has re-platformed transphobes and loves to tweak the platform whenever it wants to make sure that people who criticize him can't get their message through, or all these. I mean, the pretense of free speech, I think, is completely gone. And in some ways, I think that's helpful for where we are, in that the shamelessness has been laid bare. And so I think that provides an opportunity for the kind of argument that you're making to maybe have some more power. But can I sort of throw that back as a question for you? Would you like social media companies to hold themselves to First Amendment principles, given the kind of concern that I raised about the global nature of this? Because that really sort of makes social media companies kind of dominant in a way where we're applying US law around the world. So I'm just kind of curious, as someone who's more steeped in the law than I am, what you think about that.
So my answer is, I think yes and no. Yes, in the U.S., partly because we're seeing, I think, censorship by Musk and to some extent Zuckerberg of speech with which their profit motives are antagonistic. With at least if X abides by First Amendment principles, then they can't really shadow ban progressive activists, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, First Amendment protections in the U.S. are so robust that it would prevent, I think, places that are doing a better job of taking out the trash or banning it, like in Europe. So I wouldn't want our free speech principles to tie up the ability of platforms to protect against harmful speech globally.
I do have a question in the chat that I do want to get to, and it's just asking simply, what is epistemic appropriation? You've been using that quite a bit, so maybe this person's a little confused about exactly what does it mean. So what does that mean?
Sure. So this is a term that Emmeline Davis created to refer to when the language, the knowledge, the concepts that marginalized people produce is often taken by members outside of that group, often members of dominant groups use that language, they appropriate it, and they use it, they detach it from the context in which it was created, and they use it for their own benefit, right? So one example would be often white academics who use the concepts of people of color and detach them from that local context and understanding and use it to their own benefit and apply it to context for which it was not initially intended to be used. So it's a kind of injustice.
I think you answered that well. Are there any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'd like to ask something about, I'm just thinking about this, who takes out the trash and what are the risks of the various, we've talked about, when you ask the corporations to do it, they've got their interests. Right now, the work's being disproportionately done by marginalized folks. That seems unjust. But if folks who are not part of a marginalized community get more involved in taking out the trash, there's risks there too. And if they misidentify the trash, for example. And I think there's an interesting thing that happens sometimes with folks that they avoid getting involved in a way that they discuss as a form of deference to a marginalized community, although it may actually be more of laziness. And so I just wanted your thoughts about how to navigate that complex landscape.
Yeah, this is where I think standpoint theory developed by, feminist epistemologists is really helpful for me here, right? So obviously one of the reasons why marginalized folks might often be best positioned to identify the trash is that often they're going to be aware of concepts, dog whistles, things with theories that are inaccurate or unfair, right? To use Charles Mill's term, like white ignorance, for example. They're often going to be more aware of these kinds of problematic bits of knowledge and theories floating around. But we don't want them to have disproportionately have to spend their lives cleaning up the messes of more privileged people. So this is where standpoint theory argues, right, that members of privileged groups can also work to access the standpoint of the oppressed, right? So members of privileged groups can also work to listen to be in conversation with. So if we're thinking about on the internet, community moderation is often a really good model, right? Where privileged people who aren't experiencing the harassment or hate speech, who have really done the work to understand the community and the context well, and who are also in constant conversation with marginalized people, can take on doing some of that labor. And there can be conversations where folks can step back if they don't have the energy or space to do it, right? So having folks work together so that folks who are positioned well to understand what kind of trash needs to be taken out. And you have, so-called allies, right, who might take on the work of doing that, but are open to being called out or questioned, right, if they're not fully understanding it, who don't have what philosophers called like epistemic arrogance, who don't think that they know how to speak for other people, so they can just, take out the trash or take it upon themselves. Like there are lots of different virtues or good habits that we can develop as we work together online to listen well, to know when to step forward, when to step back. These are, I think, habits that we can develop well. And when we work on these things through community moderation, rather than top-down moderation by organizations which are doing it just for profit, often that can work really well. The problem is it's exhausting work. And so some of the studies of folks who have created their own social media spaces and who have done this kind of work is that it can completely take over one's life. So I think that is a kind of a practical challenge that we might think about. Yeah.
Well, if there are no more questions, I want to say.
Can I just ask one more? It's a kind of
please,
one.
By all means, by all means.
Sure. Well, I'm just fascinated by your work, Dr. Frost-Arnold. So I'm just wondering what's next for you, building on this paper and your book, or what you hope other scholars might pursue building on your work.
You sort of asked the nightmare question. So the obvious. The answer is I got really excited thinking about alternative social media spaces, and then I just got really discouraged. To me, it was really heartbreaking to see something that really had a lot of potential. To see, for example, Black instances on Mastodon have to close due to some of the problems that I outlined. So part of what I want to work on is, how can that be avoided? Like, what needs to happen in open source communities so that people can realistically create their own spaces? And so I've been thinking also about that in terms of decolonizing the internet. So thinking about the ways in which, as social media platforms are all located in the US, really, right? We have people around the world who are having to deal with social media spaces where they are not designed with their particular context in mind. And again, this like open source ability to create one's own social media space that's relevant to your own local community seems really exciting to me. But there are these huge barriers in front of it. So that's sort of what I'm thinking through now, but I'm very stuck. So that's why it was sort of a nightmare question. I'm a bit discouraged at this point, but thanks for asking.
We had a last question that just came in. You have like 3 minutes to answer this question, but the question is, how do you deal with this grief or disappointment?
Wow, what a question for everything that we're dealing in within the world right now. I mean, honestly, I just pick myself up and say it's a luxury to disengage. And so I just try to keep going. I try to hold myself accountable to thinking about the ways in which, I mean, not like, doing my own research is that particularly helpful to the world, but there's a way in which I do try to do my work in ways that could produce something that might hopefully be useful. And so if I encounter something that makes me feel grief or disappointment in how the world is operating, I just think, okay, well, do I have anything else that I might be able to keep contributing, or what more do I need to learn that might help me produce something that's useful? And when do I need to just step back and listen some more? I don't know that that's a very deep answer, but I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of asking that question.
It may not feel like a deep answer to you, but it felt like a really good answer. So good job on that. I think it's the appropriate answer for all that's going on in the world. So thank you so much. Again, thank you, Dr. Frost-Arnold. Thank you, Professor Tai, for participating. We will take a break. We will be back at 20 minutes past the hour. That means 2:20. We'll be back here at 2:20 for a presentation by Mary Fan on camera power. Looking forward to that. See you guys then.